You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Dr. Mindy Fullilove, who talks about her book, Main Street, How a City's Heart Connects Us All. Dr. Fullilove chats about the psychology of place, the strength of weak ties, and how cities are a part of nature. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our good friends at Transit Center and their wonderful podcast, High Frequency. In the current season, host Kapish Singla has conversations on how cities and transportation agencies are learning from past mistakes and resolving inequities in transit. You'll hear from advocates in Chicago, Austin, Miami, and Los Angeles working to improve transit. High Frequency has been on my podcatcher for a while, and it should be on yours too. Find High Frequency on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today's podcast is brought to you by our generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show. We couldn't do it without you. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month and I'll send some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month and you'll get one of our bus-only scarves with dedicated lane designs. And finally, every donation will have access to bonus features, including podcast extras that might not fit in the original cut. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of The Overhead Wire, sharing information on cities around the world with our readers and subscribers. Join us and try our one-of-a-kind daily newsletter for 2 weeks free. No credit cards, just an email address by visiting theoverheadwire.com. We've got 71,000 news links in our archive tagged by topic, so sign up and search away. And finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning in Practice. Go to raymondunwin.com to find out how you can download the book in your podcatcher and listen to each chapter like an episode of the show. Well, Mindy Fullilove, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm a social psychiatrist, and I'm a professor of urban policy and health at the New School. And I've been at the New School since 2016. Before that, I worked at New York State Psychiatric Institute, and I was on faculty at Columbia University.
And what got you interested in place?
I got interested in place because I was studying epidemics, starting with the AIDS epidemic. And I was looking at what was going on in poor and minority communities. And this was in sort of late 80s and early 90s. They were just devastated. And so the issue of why were devastated places where people had a lot of behaviors that put them at risk for illness, was one I didn't understand. So that's what got me interested. And so I started studying what people call the psychology of place. And, one thing led to another.
How is the psychology of a place connected to the physical of a place?
Well, the psychology of the place is in the people's heads. So the physical of the place is outside. So a place, the geographers particularly have said, is a bounded bit of space. So space is everything. Then there are little bits of it that have a boundary. So the room you're in, the room I'm in, these are places. But the room you're in is in a building, the room I'm in is a building, and then the building is somewhere. So all of those are places once you've set the boundary. So when you're thinking about place, you have to think about the boundary. And then obviously there are within any boundary, like within a house, there are rooms in a house or apartments in apartment buildings, etc. So there are lots of little places beside each other. Even if I'm in the state of New Jersey, there's 49 other states. So it gets to be complicated because I have to think about, my place is located at such a place, but there are parallel places, almost like parallel universes. And in place, once you set the boundary, everything inside that is the place. So all the physical, all the social, all the psychological is part of what's going on. It's very complicated.
Yeah, it's now you got me thinking now about all of these parallel universes that are happening. Well, I've often thought about that in terms of, we operate in our spaces, in our neighborhoods, in our homes, and I often think, and you go and visit another space, and it's kind of strange to think about this space operates as it does every day, daily, but I'm not here. I'm in another place, but this is operating, and I have no recollection or understanding of what's going on there. And so it's kind of something interesting to think. It's almost like an out-of-body experience to a certain extent. You go somewhere and you're like, this place exists all the time, but I don't experience it all the time.
Yeah, I agree.
I want to step back a little bit to your previous work. We're going to talk a little bit about Main Street, which is your most recent book, but I want to ask you about root shock because I think it's a really important kind of precedent to what we're going to talk about today. What brought you to write the book, and what is root shock, I guess, for folks that might not know about it?
But if we start with the other question first, we'll arrive at what is root shock. So I was studying the psychology of place, and so psychiatry is about disorder and illness. So I was very interested in things that had made people ill. But one of the ways I studied was to just ask people about their experiences of place, their stories. But a set of stories that came up over and over again were stories of people who'd been displaced by urban renewal, which was a program in the US in the 50s and 60s. Two people were particularly important in helping me understand urban renewal. One was David Jenkins, who had been displaced from his community at age 11. And the other was Mary Bishop, a journalist who'd written about urban renewal in Roanoke, Virginia. So they really were the people who oriented me to what had happened in urban renewal. And it was such a big experience. And it seemed to me it was like pulling a plant out of the ground. And gardeners have a term for what can happen to a plant if you just yank it out of the ground because it tears the roots and it can go into shock, and they call that root shock. And it seemed to me that what had happened to people who'd been rudely displaced from their homes was this kind of experience of root shock. And, it was unsettling, it disturbed their growth. Some people got settled again, but some people couldn't and they died. So it was root shock that really became the image that I had for the massive disruption that this causes in people's lives.
Yeah, and it seems like it's akin to brain damage to a certain extent. Recently, we had a discussion with Andres Sevstuk about weak ties and connecting people and jobs to commerce. He was on a show a couple of weeks ago. And after reading your book, I felt like it's much more than that. It feels like these disruptions of weak ties through the urban renewal, through dispersal tactics, are akin to this brain damage. Why is it that these weak ties are so much more important than maybe, many of us understood before?
People talk about it. And in fact, Mark Granovetter, who is one of the sociologists who really described weak ties, talked about it really as paradox. The strength of weak ties is the title of his classic article. Why would weak ties be what's strong? But in a society, strong ties actually are what make us weak, and weak ties are what make us strong. So that's the paradox. So the strong ties are the ties of like we share religion or we share race or we share neighborhood. Those are strong ties. But weak ties are like the guy you're on a nodding acquaintance with at the local convenience store. And you don't know his name, you've never been to his house, but he knows you're part of the neighborhood. And if you were, during checkout complaining that, it was hard to get somebody to shovel your sidewalk, he would know somebody who was looking for work and he would say, I'll send somebody by. You could hire that person to shovel your sidewalk. That's a weak tie. And it's those, because they bridge communities, bridge groups of strong ties that make society strong. So when you do urban renewal or something like that, you damage the way society functions. Now, societies have to work, people have to work together because they constantly have to solve problems. Whatever was going on yesterday created today, but today is new issues. For us personally, for us as families, there's always new issues. It's like when your kid is a toddler, you can't get him to take a bath or go to bed. But when your kid is a teenager, you can't get him to take a bath or go to bed. But it's different issues. You have to have different strategies. You have to keep up with the kid. So the kid changes every day, and you got to have new strategies every day. So the families have to be able to do problem solving. Same with societies. They have to problem solve for today. But if you've broken all the weak ties, you can't have a good conversation. So society can't solve its problems. And that's where US society is right now. We've broken the weak ties and we can't have good conversations and we can't solve our problems.
What's the main way that we've broken weak ties?
It's not a main way. It's that we keep uprooting communities over and over. So urban renewal in the 50s, there was a program called planned shrinkage, which was disinvestment, deindustrialization, where we just knocked the economy out from all of our industrial cities. So it's multiple programs over time. Think about COVID. All the people who have lost their jobs and their jobs may not come back and they're facing eviction because we've hardly had any disaster relief for people. So they have to move because at some points they said 40 million people were at risk of eviction in the United States. Well, move 40 million people and see what happens to your society. It's pretty devastating.
That whole thing doesn't make sense to me, the evictions, just because if there's so many people that are out of work and they can't move or they're not going to move and they want to stay in their homes, if you push them out and all of those people are pushed out at the same time, how are you going to feel? Like, the idea of the landlord wants to, recoup their expenses, but how are they going to get somebody else to fill that space if so many people are out getting moved out? Is it just going to be a mass shuffling? I haven't comprehended yet why. I mean, I understand individual circumstances, I guess, but on a global scale, maybe people just aren't thinking about it in that perspective. I don't know.
I'm a psychiatrist, so I think it's nutty. I mean, I'm with you. This makes no sense. What you want is a disaster relief plan that pays the rent for people till we get through this thing. And that's got to, it keeps dragging on. So we just got to keep paying the rent. The landlords are okay. The people are okay. The society is stable. We get through this pandemic, and then we don't have to pay people's rent. We make some jobs, and then people go back to work and they get off rent relief. But not having rent relief makes no sense to me.
Yeah. At the beginning of the pandemic, right at the start, I was like, we should just shut down for 2 months or whatever it is and just pay everybody's bills, just give everybody money to pay their rent, to pay whatever they need to do, just so they stay in place. They don't have to go and do what they felt like they needed to do and leave the house and go and mix up with everybody else. And we just keep dragging it on. That is a whole other subject, obviously, but I mean, it's related, but it's frustrating, obviously.
But it's not a whole other subject, because that's completely logical. That was a good way to manage the pandemic, but we couldn't have that conversation. We had a lot of bitter disputes and a lot of abandonment. So we didn't have a way as a society to have a sensible conversation about how do you manage a disaster of this order.
Yeah. In the book, there's a story about saving Coogan's, which is a popular bar in Washington Heights. And their landlord was threatening a crazy rent increase, and it happened to be a local hospital. And I also read that recently they paid it forward by raising money to save 22 businesses, even though they themselves had unfortunately closed. And it's such a bummer. But I'm curious, like, that's like an individual example of everything that's been happening during the pandemic. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on kind of what the pandemic has been doing to communities, to connections, to these main streets that you talk about, and how kind of maybe it's different than what you expected to talk about when you finished the book. And I know you finished the book during the pandemic, but you did a lot of your research ahead of it.
Yeah. So Coogan's was located on Broadway. So it's a classic example of a Main Street business. And just a wonderful, wonderful locally owned local business that served all the communities in Washington Heights. The people who started it are just very kind, good people. They started it during a violence epidemic that was going on. So it was a dangerous time. And they created a very welcoming space that welcomed everybody. So they became a true force for good in the community and were beloved. So when the hospital said they were going to up the rent by $40,000 a month or something absurd, the people at Coogan's let everybody know. The whole community rose up. They collected 15,000 signatures on a petition in 2 days. And all the local power brokers who always went to Coogan's to talk politics insisted to the hospital that they back off. So the hospital did. So the community saved Coogan's, but they saved Coogan's because Coogan's was part of saving the community. It's a very beautiful story. When the pandemic hit, the owners said, we can't handle it. Basically because there wasn't enough disaster relief. And for example, the insurance company wouldn't back down on how much insurance they should pay, even though they were closed. So it's a real example of we had a bad program for supporting small businesses. And so we let crucial pieces of our social infrastructure go away, close, disappear. That's all across America that happened. So we're in very bad shape from that, and we were not in good shape before. Therefore, one of the things that I've thought a lot about coming out of the pandemic as we sort of edge towards the future is that main streets are a core piece of how our cities are organized. And we really want main streets to be strong again, because that's a tool for solving all the other problems that we have. That's going to mean different things for every main street in every city. And so the issue becomes, as we start to ease out of our houses, getting people to go look at what happened on their main street and then start to think, therefore, what do we do? And it's going to be different, but everybody's going to need to have very local strategies that should be really supported. For example, in the new infrastructure bill, main streets are a crucial part of our physical and social infrastructure. So supporting the local businesses on main streets, I think, is a crucial piece.
Yeah, it's interesting that this discussion about infrastructure and what is and what isn't infrastructure. I hold a broad definition of infrastructure myself, but those social pieces are really important. And inside the infrastructure bill are pieces about care. There's pieces about broadband and connectivity. There's pieces that are discussing all kinds of social issues that some would not say are infrastructure, but why is infrastructure a social construct as well?
It's a really important question. By the way, and this is an aside, when South Korea was making a plan for how to develop itself, one of the things they did was install broadband nationwide. They have broadband that's the fastest in the world, 5 times faster than our best internet, or maybe 100 times, very much faster than what we have. Everybody has it everywhere. And if you're on the subway, you can even have broadband as you're going through tunnels, so you can watch your show on your phone. That's the competition, South Korea. South Korea was an underdeveloped country. It became competition because they understood technology to be part of the infrastructure of the future, the way roads were part of the infrastructure of the past. So I think we have to look around and say, well, what is helping other societies to get ahead? Because we'd like to remain competitive. The social is part of the infrastructure because we are social. And a society is made up of
We're humans.
we're humans. We're not living by ourselves. Some people want to go off and be hermits, but most of us are hanging out together and we want to hang out together. And that's how we make society. You'll have a healthier society if everybody is very sociable. So the people who have thousands of people in their network, you can have a society where everybody has thousands of people in their network. That's a very strong society. So think of those being in network, like we draw maps of networks with lines. Think of those as like a net. So if everybody has only 100 people in their network, you only have 100 lines between that person and other people. If a person has 1,000 people, that's a lot more lines. And if everybody has 1,000 people, then the density of lines is so dense, a very strong society. That's a society that can solve its problems. And you would agree, we have horrific problems right now between global warming and pandemics, this pandemic and whatever the next pandemic is going to be. We have a lot of problems. If we can't talk to each other, we have to invent a solution, a lot of solutions, and then we have to get people to go along with it. If we can't talk to each other, how's that going to happen? Well, answer, it's not going to happen, and we're going to be in deeper trouble. So social infrastructure is the foundation of a strong and healthy society, and healthy economically, healthy physically, healthy mentally, healthy spiritually.
How many main streets did you visit while you were working on the book?
I didn't count by Main Street, I counted by cities. And I went to 178 cities in 14 countries over the 11 years I was working on the book. So many of those cities had more than one main street. So for example, Pittsburgh has a whole lot of main streets. So I've been to many of the main streets in Pittsburgh, or New York City has an infinite number of main streets. So I didn't count by main street. And then some of those main streets are like the main street where I live, I went all the time. Some of them I went just once. So it was a lot of variety.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about going to a place just once and how you feel about a place as opposed to going to a place multiple times a day, even if you live near a main street. I'm curious if you wish in some of those places that you visited, you had gotten more time to spend. I have this dream where I'd love to live to like 1,000 years old and then go and live in each of these little places for a year, 2 years, 3 years, or something like that, and get a longer term kind of experience. Obviously, that's not happening without some crazy medical science or brain implantation to robots kind of thing. But I'm always kind of feeling that I want to be in a lot of different places, even though I can't. Do you ever get that kind of feeling that you wanted to stick around maybe a little longer, or you wanted to understand the place a little bit deeper?
I really had that feeling very strongly when I was in Johannesburg in South Africa, and I was staying in a hotel on Grant Street, and it had a little balcony that looked over the Grant Street, and it had a bakery, so I could sit on the balcony and look at the bakery. And the bakery had this fantastic bread, and they had rye bread. I could have poached eggs on rye bread. I didn't realize how much I love poached eggs on rye bread. Like I hadn't had that in a long time. But this bakery, Baked on Grant, I would just go there, and there was a bookstore, and there were all kinds of interesting people going up and down the street. There was this guy who was like drunk by very early in the morning, and he would just sit down and just be sad, and all kinds of interesting people walking up and down. I really wanted to just stay in that hotel, in that room, and like set my laptop up on the balcony and just watch Grant Street and write my book.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, it was wonderful. I just wanted to stay there.
In the book, you talk about the process that you went through to do your studies, the biopsychosocial model versus a biomedical model. Can you explain that a little bit more in detail?
Biomedical just means you're thinking about what's going on inside the person. So the organ systems, the molecules, the this and that, inside the person. Biopsychosocial model says there's stuff going on inside us, but we're also located in place in all these relationships. And you have to take that into account when you're treating somebody, which our systems are rarely set up to take that into account. But in fact, we know that the nature of the life people are living is what's determining what's going to happen to them. So why leave it out? And it shows up in many interesting ways. I was visiting in Minneapolis and got to hear a talk by a man who was developing a new clinic in a South Minneapolis neighborhood. And he said that they had done 2,000 interviews with people to design the clinic. And it was in a neighborhood with a lot of different immigrant groups. And one of the things that people said was that the examination rooms they had designed were too small. They built models of the exam room so people could visit. And people said, it's too small. And they said, why? And they said, because they said it's big enough for the doctor and the patient. They said, no, we all go into the exam room, the whole family, like 10 people. So you have to be big enough for 10 people to come in. I mean, this is not in the Western model of who goes into the exam room at all, where it's all about privacy. That's no 10 people. So I just found that such a good example of if you really start to say to people, well, you're going to have an exam. How many people should be in the room? 10. I would never think of that. But if you start to look at the social in a real way, like people have different things they need, but it's real. The 10 people being in the room is how they're going to make the decision. And that's what's going to keep the person healthy in the end. Think about having a chronic disease and having to take medicine. People don't take medicine for their chronic diseases. But if all 10 people in your family were there and talked to the doctor and heard the diagnosis and knew what was coming, the 10 people would keep you in line. So it's much better medicine.
Yeah, it makes sense. I know that my my grandma has a specific medicine she doesn't like taking.
Exactly.
And if she didn't, it would be trouble. And we kind of keep on her about making sure and the folks that stay with her make sure that she keeps on going. So that makes a lot of sense to me in that context.
But we're all like your grandma more than we like to admit.
Yes. Oh, I don't like taking stuff if I don't have to or want to, and nobody likes to feel like they're dependent on something that they need, you know.
No, or we want to eat 2 servings of ice cream, or we don't want to exercise, or we don't want to brush our teeth or use floss, or every one of us has something we don't want to do. That's where the community has to help us.
Yeah, that's beneficial, right?
Yeah, it is.
What do you think the impact of main streets are on cities? I mean, you talked briefly about this before, but I always wonder if we like them for what they provide us. We like them for their sometimes aesthetic value. We like them for the community ties that they bring us. But when it comes to like policies to protect them, to nurture them, to support the activities that go on there, maybe sometimes we aren't as progressive in that way that we should be. And it can be frustrating. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
The United States is not a country that has sensible urban policy. So that's kind of the starting point.
I mean, I probably wouldn't have this podcast if we did.
So there you go. Well, we want you.
I agree with you
To stay busy. There's a lot to keep you busy. We don't have sensible urban policy. So why would we be sensible about main streets? We're not. So what main streets need is not what we're giving main streets. It's other things designed to do other things, whatever is in the minds of the policymakers, but not based on a sound sense of urban ecosystems and how they work. Jane Jacobs was the greatest American urbanist. And in her book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, she says that the policy should be not a single sparrow. Not a single sparrow will be harmed by our policies. And that's a high bar, but that's the right bar. Because we also have to be thinking, we become more sophisticated. We have to be thinking about the sparrows and the bees and the wolves and the dolphins. They're thinking about all the creatures in the world. Hong Kong, they shut down high-speed ferries and the dolphins have come back. And it turns out that where the ferries go is one of the dolphins' preferred places, pink dolphins. And who wouldn't rather have pink dolphins than a high-speed ferry? So can you put the ferry someplace else or not make it high speed? Or we have to live together with the pink dolphins. So not a single sparrow is what we should be doing. That's not what we're doing. Now, does this work for our cities to have bad policies? Obviously not, because our cities are not beautiful, they're not prosperous, they're not the engine of invention that they should be. So these policies are not helping us be a better nation. Not to mention that these policies fracture the social bonds and leave us mad at each other. So they're really harmful policies. Not only are they not good, they're actively bad.
Yeah, we live in this symbiotic relationship with nature and our neighbors and our cities and our places. And I don't know that we quite understand the extent. I mean, I think we do to a minimal extent, but as we're seeing climate change and the changes in, sea level rise and, the biomass and all that stuff, we're starting to see these drastic things happening. I just was reading about, and it's frustrating that our monarch butterflies here on the West Coast are disappearing. Obviously, everybody's heard about the bees and, the flowering plants and all that stuff. So we live in this, symbiotic relationship with nature that we seem to continue to damage.
I would certainly agree that we live in relationship, but it's important to not separate people from nature. We're animals. We are our nature, and bees make hives and bears make dens and beavers make ponds and we make cities. So our cities are part of nature also. This is all nature. And the idea that there's nature over there and I'm over here, or I'm in my house, so that's not nature, I think is a dualism that doesn't help us. We have to understand that we're in this big scheme of things, just as they say, one of the bozos on the bus. There's the bees, there's the beavers, and we are also on the bus of the planet.
Of the planet, right. It's a one big spaceship.
It's one big spaceship. So like, okay, how are things going on the bus? Not that well.
Was there something that got to you during the book, during the research, that you didn't expect? Was there anything that came up that was surprising in looking at all of these main streets and looking at all of these folks and what they were doing in their communities?
I would say not so much surprising as it was just took a while to see the big picture, because the picture was bigger than the way I was framing it. Even my proposition, I will go to visit main streets. So as I came to think about them as like box, circle, line, tangle. So the box being the place we usually think of as Main Street, the civic commercial center of a street. So I was going to visit that, and I was going to visit 100 main streets and be done. But in a way, what I had to understand was the proposition was wrong. That all of these boxes of Main Street are on these lines, which are the actual streets, and the streets go other places. So all the main streets are interconnected with all the main streets, which is what I came to think of as a tangle. And it wasn't until I really could articulate and give it a name, say that's the tangle. And not that the name is important, but I had a name that it was this complex, this spaghetti thing of streets. And it's a tangle because I was looking at the map of Essex County, where it's a tangle of streets. Until I could name that, I hadn't kind of got the big picture. That took a while.
Yeah, and it's interesting, those connections, because you could go to one main street for one thing and then another main street for another thing, but they are all interconnected. It's really interesting to think about.
Exactly. I could go to one main street and then another main street, and then another main street in the same day, in the same shopping trip. Because they're not repetitive.
No. And every place has its own little quirky stores and characters and folks that you need to go visit.
Exactly.
You talk about the box, and this is kind of your process for understanding main streets, the box, circle, tangle, and then time as well. What creates the experience of the box in a commercial district?
Well, one thing is that I wouldn't call it a commercial district. It's like civic, commercial, social, public. So it's an amalgam. So it's the amalgamation of all those things that's so important. So in a way, it's congestion. It's bringing all those things together. What creates the box is actually how we have evolved the architecture, so that the kinds of buildings we put on Main Street are buildings that create walls, and we put them right next to each other. So it creates the sense of being inside something. So that's what I call the box.
How did you come up with the box? I mean, was it just from trial and error going to all these places and kind of experiencing it and understanding that this is something that's similar between all these places?
My studies started on Palisades Avenue in Englewood, New Jersey, which has a great box and a pretty strong circle. And Palisades Ave is a real line, like it goes somewhere in each direction. But right next door to Englewood is Tenafly, and it's organized very differently. So when we went to Tenafly, I was like, wait, this place doesn't have a circle. It had a box, but a little box, but not a circle. Like the circle being kind of the dense urban tissue that the box is set in. They had just cleaned everything out and made parking lots.
Mm.
Yeah, it was kind of grim. And I thought of it as like those false facades in Western movies. Did you ever see the Mel Brooks film Blazing Saddles? And there's a point at which they break the fourth wall and they pull the camera back, and you can see that this town is just a facade.
Yeah. It's just a wall
It's just a
of
wall,
plywood.
nothing behind it, just tumbleweed. Tenafly is like that. It reminded me of Blazing Saddles. So that taught me about the circle. But then as I went to other places, I would say Maplewood, New Jersey is classic. Really, I could feel that thing that is so cool in Englewood, of this sense of enclosure, and then a lot of good stuff there. So it was very much a feeling, like you could feel that you were in the box.
That makes so much sense. It feels like, it's almost like an arcade when you go to those covered shopping areas in places in Europe where they have these old, shopping
Yes.
districts. And it's not just, it's a box, literally. It's an arcade, it's a covered walkway, and they have on both sides shops and glass and stuff like that. It's just literally, that's what it is, a box. This is going to be kind of a strange question, but I hope you can answer it. If you're going to go to Mars and create a new city, how would you create a good Main Street?
Well, that is a strange question. People say that rich people like Elon Musk, their plan for what they're going to do when they've ruined the Earth is either to go into bunkers or to go to Mars. And I don't know if that's their plan because I never talked to any of them. But I got to go to Istanbul. And so my answer to that question is, why would you want to go to Mars when you could go to Istanbul?
That's a good answer.
And it's just like, that's insane. It's so many millennia, like 100,000 years of figuring out how to make a city. And you make a city best over 100,000 years. Think about Istanbul, how long people have been living in Istanbul and what they've made. It's so miraculous. And why would you not go there and have some simit and ride a ferry and look at Istanbul and just marvel? Why'd you go to Mars? I think going to Mars is stupid. We have to save this.
There's no blue mosque on Mars. That's not the answer that I was expecting, but it's definitely the right answer. I mean, I feel like a lot of the discussion about even new cities now, there's a discussion about this city in Saudi Arabia, Neom. There's a discussion about creating a new city outside of Egypt. And I'm always interested to see why they want to build new cities, but I think it's because they want to make it a little bit more sterile. And like you said, it's not historic. It's not developed over time. It's not organic growth. And I'm always curious why they would want to make new cities. Obviously, my Mars question was silly and ridiculous, and I mentioned that. But I think it's the same thing for some of these kind of new towns that people want to make as well.
It's a little bit like somebody makes a perfect meal and then they present it to you at a restaurant, and the parsley and everything is just perfect and it's so gorgeous. And the first thing you do is take your fork and mess it up. And so, you're going to make Brasilia, right? And the first thing people are going to do is take their fork and mess it up. They're going to put graffiti on it. So skip that part where you make the new city and just take the old fabulous city and say, how do we make this fabulous city better? There are a lot of things people in Istanbul would like help with. So could Istanbul become more Istanbul. And then there are a lot of forces that want to sterilize Istanbul and make it Brasilia. So this is a big fight. But I think that the big fight comes from our failure to acknowledge that we're bozos on the bus with the pink dolphins and the bees.
It sounds like a good episode title, Bozos on the Bus.
It's the heart of everything. Do you know you're a bozo on the bus?
Yeah. Do you know? Was there a main street that you visited in a place where maybe technically it shouldn't have been? Or this is kind of an offshoot of the previous discussion we just had about cities and their organic nature?
Where there shouldn't have been a main street?
Sure.
I don't think so. But that could be the way I think about it. I always think there should be a main street. Like, there's a main street. I always think there is a main street.
Well, I want to share the book with folks. The book is Main Street, How a City's Heart Connects Us All by Dr. Mindy Fullilove. Where can folks find it if they want to pick up a copy?
Well, I like to send people to the publisher, New Village Press, their website, and they'll get it out to you right away.
That's a good place. We often say try to go to your local bookshops as well and support those. You can usually order it from them if you get a chance. Or bookshop.org. They give proceeds to the local bookshops if you can't get outside your house because of the pandemic. So we appreciate that as well. And where can folks find you online or contact you if they want to talk to you about the book?
Well, they could find me on, at New School. My email is easily available if they wanted to write to me. And I have a website, mindyfullilove.com.
Awesome.
They can also find me on Contently.
Contently? I've never heard of Contently. What's Contently?
It's a really cool website where you show your products.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, Mindy, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old daily cities news list by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.